First, this week's 1 on 1 in 10 with leader of the Labour Party, Chris Hipkins. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show and thank you for being available to the Fourth Estate. Your democracy is grateful.
Very good to be here, Bobber. Great to talk to you.
Chippy, can we start, please, with the current COVID inquiry? I believe, passionately, that you, Jacinda, Grant and your team did an incredible job during a once-in-a-century pandemic. I believe you led with honour and courage to put public health ahead of profit margins. Of course, there were mistakes because it was an unprecedented event, but the revisionist history, led by the likes of Ryan Bridge, Paddy Gower and Sir Ian Taylor playing Captain Hindsight, must really grind your gears. What do you say to those who would so cheaply diminish our collective lockdown sacrifice?
I think we have to recognise that it was a really tough time for the country. So yes, I think our pandemic response was really successful in keeping people alive, which of course is the number one metric in a pandemic, keeping people alive. But also, I think what does get lost in this is we had fewer days of lockdown in New Zealand than in a whole lot of the other countries we compare ourselves to. But we shouldn't discount that if you lost a loved one during that time, or your business went broke during that time, or you had other things that affected you, it was really, really tough. And so I want to make sure that this Royal Commission actually isn't about the politicians or politicians pursuing a political agenda. It should be about giving people the opportunity to talk about how the pandemic might have affected them, how we can do it better next time, because there will be a next time. And undoubtedly, when you have the benefit of 2020 hindsight, there are going to be things that could have been improved, and we do need to capture those. But I hope we can do that in a way that it doesn't just become a political kind of shoving exercise, but actually becomes one about how do we do this better if we have to do it again.
Preach. The manner in which those sacked by the mandates, they had to stand down before they received welfare, and the fact that many couldn't get their jobs back after the mandates ended up making many of those Kiwis feel othered in a way that was probably unique to them, and they have been embittered ever since. What lessons must future governments set when dealing with those who, for whatever reason, don't want a vaccine?
Look, I think the first Royal Commission actually was quite right in describing our COVID response as a game of two halves. And I think the reason it was a game of two halves is in the first part of our response, which was the first sort of year and a half to nearly almost 2 years, we had huge amounts of public support for what we were doing. People were right behind it. There was a huge amount of collective commitment to doing the right thing. And I think once we got to the period around vaccination, we do have to recognise that that was when the social bonds that had held us together for 2 years really did start to stray. I have to say vaccination was some of the hardest stuff that we worked through as a government, because it's often, you look back on this now and it's easy to forget what else was going on at the time. You had people saying, we're not going to go to work unless everybody in our workplace has been vaccinated. You had parents saying, we're not going to send our kids to school unless teachers have been vaccinated. You had people saying, I'm a nurse or a doctor, I don't want to be seeing people who haven't been vaccinated. So there was a lot of pressure, and it was such a difficult balancing exercise for the government to navigate through. And, if I have one regret, it was the fact that we did lose that social cohesion during that time.
Auckland in the last lockdown did the heavy lifting so that the rest of New Zealand could get vaccinated. We sacrificed a hell of a lot to make the rest of New Zealand safer. Did Auckland deserve to be thanked better for that sacrifice?
I think there's, in retrospect, there's some things that we should have done. We should have actually been, when the boundary was removed and when the lockdown ended for Auckland, we should have had the whole government in Auckland on the ground talking to people about how they'd been affected by it. What did we need to do to kickstart things again? Because I think that kind of getting things moving again in Auckland was too slow once the restrictions were moved. When I look back on it now, and I talked to the first Royal Commission about this, you get a lot of advice when the pandemic starts on this is how you successfully manage a pandemic. The bit where the advice is patchy is what do you do when you get to the other end of it? And I think that is the bit that we've got the biggest lessons to learn from, is how you kind of get back to normal. Because that was the bit that I think was really challenging for us. We struggled to get things back to normal again.
Let's talk economy. Centrix reported this month that 758 construction businesses have gone into liquidation in the last 12 months, thanks in part to the government's freeze on transport, housing and hospital investment spending at the beginning of 2024, meaning construction jobs have fallen by 12,723 in the last year, while 30,000 Kiwis have left New Zealand. This government believes if you amputate the state, the market will step in and do it cheaper. How's that ideological experiment working out for Kiwis?
Well, exactly. When I think your numbers are a bit conservative there, Bomber. It's about 15,000 fewer jobs in building and construction if you go back to election day. And actually, it's something like 180,000 New Zealanders overall have left since the election. It's just the government talk about the net figures. So that, we have a whole lot of people leave and then more people come in. But actually, surely we want to create a situation where people who are already here want to stay here. I think I've got the number here. It's 47,300 Kiwis have given up in the last year and gone to Australia. Come on. We want to keep these people here in New Zealand. And what does that involve? It involves getting the basics right, like jobs, health, homes, real action on the cost of living. Remember when, Christopher Luxon was challenged during the election campaign about the fact that he promised families with kids $250 a fortnight. Well, a year and a half in, he cannot identify one single family that's received the full $250 a fortnight that he promised them.
Bernard Hickey reports that the services sector joined the manufacturing sector in contracting in June. BNZ downgraded its Q2 GDP forecast to a contraction, while Stats New Zealand also reported yesterday another 0.2% fall in total spending with electronic cards in June, which means retail sales have fallen 7.5% in inflation-adjusted terms in the last 2 years. Where is the economic growth we were promised from this government?
Well, the government don't seem to have a plan to generate economic growth, but they also don't seem willing to acknowledge that what they're doing is making things worse and not better. So, Nicola Willis seems to think that businesses on Lambton Quay going under is because people are working from home, let alone the fact that she's laid off thousands of people. And perhaps that's actually the reason people aren't out and about and on Lambton Quay spending money, because if they don't know they're going to have a job tomorrow, then they're less likely to be going out there and spending money. And similarly, those 15,000 fewer jobs in building and construction, well, that flows through into the services sector and into retail and hospitality, and it has a big knock-on effect. So what the government have done is taken what was a challenging time for the country, no question, but they've made it so much worse than it needed to be. We could have been well on the road to recovery by now if the government hadn't decided to do the slash and burn that they did. They talk a big game on infrastructure. What have they done? In reality, they've reduced the amount of money that we're spending on infrastructure. Right at the time when we should be keeping people in work in those areas, they're driving them to Australia.
We are three huge, sparsely populated islands. Free market dynamics don't work when you have such low population density, which is why the state in New Zealand has always needed to be the 35% to 40% foundation stone. Why is this government hell-bent on rescinding the state's obligations and simply leaving it to the free market?
Oh, this is the government that we've seen in New Zealand's recent history that's the most committed to the neoliberal way of thinking about the economy. But also this arbitrary restriction on the size of government. Let's go to the capitalist capital of the world, the United States. And some of the biggest advances in technology that have happened in the US in my lifetime have been because the government supported it. Many people will be watching this on an iPhone or an iPad or a flat screen. Well, actually, the technology behind that was funded by government. Private sector businesses have commercialized it, but the government funded the R&D behind it. Every time you use GPS, every time you use Siri or Alexa or one of those voice-activated technologies, you're using technology that governments have helped to support. And this idea that if we just shrink the size of government, everything will get better. Let's talk about the real world experience of that. The reality is the opposite happens.
When it was the Treaty Principles referendum, every academic, expert, iwi and critic were all wrong and only David Seymour was right. Now it's the Regulatory Standards Bill and lo and behold, every academic, expert, iwi and critic are all wrong again. Only David is right. Is it fair that David Seymour has so much self-esteem when the people his policies hurt have so little ego?
Well, if you want an example of just how ridiculous this has become for the government. They are now actively investigating whether they will need to provide compensation to Bitcoin bros in the event that they ban Bitcoin ATM machines. It is now that absurd. You'll get a situation where anti-smoking situations, where we do things to reduce smoking, will have to compensate the tobacco companies for it. This is how absurd life is becoming in David Seymour's view of the world. And Christopher Luxon is allowing him to do this. The Prime Minister has no control over his own government. Winston Peters, David Seymour, Shane Jones, they can do whatever they want, and Luxon seems to have no control over that whatsoever. You've now got Winston Peters and David Seymour slugging it out in public over whether David Seymour should be writing to the UN or not, and whether Christopher Luxon's allowed to have an opinion on that or not. This is now no longer a joke. This is New Zealand's international reputation that's being trashed.
Have you ever in your political life seen a letter sent from the New Zealand government to the UN that was that openly hostile?
Well, no, I haven't, but also I've not seen a situation where the Prime Minister then goes and retracts the letter but says that he agrees with it. Then the Minister of Foreign Affairs said the Prime Minister had no right to say that he agreed with the letter that David Seymour said. Who's actually in charge in this government? And why can't these people sit in a room together and figure out what New Zealand's position should be before they go embarrassing the country internationally? Because it's not the first time this has happened. You had Christopher Luxon jumping on a plane, bouncing around the world saying, I'm going to sort out the trade war. Little old New Zealand's going to resolve international trade and end the trade war. While Winston Peters is literally traveling around the world at the same time saying there is no trade war and this is all hysterical stuff. If you're another country looking at New Zealand, you'll be looking at us going, what? What has happened to New Zealand?
Right. ACT claim to be the party of free speech, yet have branded all critics of the Regulatory Standards Bill as victims of the day who suffer Regulatory Standards Bill derangement syndrome. How is publishing an enemies list of critics supporting free speech?
I mean, look, if you believe in free speech, you have to be willing to accept that people are going to call you out and particularly challenge you if you're wrong. David Seymour's wrong all of the time, and his solution is to personally denigrate and attack the people who are actually putting up good evidence-based arguments against the things that he's doing. If his arguments were so strong, why isn't he actually focused on the argument? Why is he trying to denigrate the people who are making legitimate, well-researched, well-informed arguments to say that what he's doing is wrong?
Chippy, we, the people, elect you, our representative, to decide on the laws of New Zealand. Why would we give corporate and polluter interests $20 million per year to vet legislation using a narrow libertarian interpretation of property rights over human rights?
I think that's exactly the point. The reality here is this bill tries to enshrine two sets of rights. You get a superior set of rights if you own property, and then you have lesser rights if you don't own property. There was a time in New Zealand where you had to own property in order to be able to vote in elections.
Right.
We did away with that generations ago. That thinking should be banished to previous centuries. It has no place in modern New Zealand. Everybody shouldn't have their rights determined by whether or not they have money or whether or not they have property. That is just the wrong way of thinking about everything. It's the reason that I have been very proud to say repeatedly since David Seymour introduced this bill into Parliament, we will repeal it as one of the first things we do when we're back in government.
Amen. Amen. Finally, Chris, Tamaki Makaurau by-election. What do Māori voters want from Labour?
I think that what we've been hearing from Māori voters is they want us to focus on the things that affect everybody, like jobs, health, homes, real action on the cost of living, making sure that we've got strong voices for Māori around the decision-making table here in Wellington. And that's exactly what we'll be campaigning on. Peeni Henare has sat around the cabinet table. I think he only missed out by the narrowest of margins last time. Yeah. And I think we owe it to those people who voted for him last time to give them another chance to back him to be back there as their local MP.
Preach. Thank you, comrades. Speak to you next month. Cheers, Chippy.
Good as gold. Great to talk to you, Bomber.
Be well, mate.